Welcome to The Explainer. We're diving into a moment when a massive political scandal and a sudden foreign war crashed into each other, raising one very serious question.
It's a wild question, right? But in early 2026, two huge events took over the headlines, and it forced people to ask just that. It sounds like something straight out of a political thriller, but the timing of everything made it, well, pretty much impossible to ignore.
So on one hand, you had this legally required release of explosive documents from the Jeffrey Epstein case, which the government was, actively stalling, and on the other hand, a sudden military invasion of Venezuela. Two totally separate crises that very quickly became one massive story.
So how in the world did these two events get so tangled up? Well, to really get it, we have to start with the scandal that set the whole stage.
It all kicked off with a promise of transparency. A bipartisan law, which was a pretty rare thing to see in Washington, was supposed to bring some of the country's darkest secrets out into the open.
So in late 2025, Congress passed this thing called the Epstein Files Transparency Act. And the goal was super simple: force the Department of Justice to finally release the millions of pages of documents from the whole Epstein investigation. And at the time, everyone saw it as a huge win for transparency. But that victory, it didn't last long. By the legal deadline in December and moving into early 2026, this is the percentage of documents the Justice Department had actually bothered to release. Less than 1%. The promise of transparency was completely broken.
And you really have to look at the timing here, because it is just incredibly tight. The deadline for the files is blown past, public outrage starts to bubble up, and then bam! Just 2 weeks later, on January 2nd, the entire nation's attention is violently ripped away to a new war.
And people didn't see this as just some bureaucratic delay. Oh no, accusations of a deliberate cover-up started flying. Critics were pointing to the Deputy Attorney General meeting with Ghislaine Maxwell right before she got moved to a lower security prison, which is a super unusual move. Then reports started leaking that specific photos were being scrubbed from the few files that were actually released.
Okay, now for the other half of the story, the sudden war that just completely hijacked the news cycle.
So, officially, the administration gave three pretty clear reasons for the invasion. They said it was to stop President Maduro's so-called drug terrorism, to grab Venezuelan oil to bring down gas prices at home, and to push back on Chinese and Russian influence in the area. On paper, it's a straightforward foreign policy goal.
But with the Epstein scandal reaching a boiling point, the timing of this invasion felt convenient, a little too convenient for a lot of people. And that is where the Wag the Dog theory just exploded into the mainstream.
Now, if you're not familiar, Wag the Dog is a classic political term. It describes the cynical strategy of basically manufacturing a crisis overseas to pull everyone's attention away from a really damaging problem at home. The question on everyone's mind was, were we watching it happen in real time?
This theory just captured the public imagination instantly, and it quickly became a punchline for late-night hosts. This joke from Jimmy Kimmel just perfectly summed it all up. The size of the distraction has to match the size of the scandal you're trying to hide. But this wasn't just a joke for comedians. You had prominent politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez asking the exact same questions out loud, suggesting the war's timing was designed to distract from an explosive scandal. And that's what really moved this theory from the fringes right into the heart of the political debate.
And this gives you a sense of just how divided the country was. A YouGov poll from January of 26 showed that nearly half of all Americans believed the war was, in fact, a cover-up. The nation was basically split right down the middle, not sure what or who to believe anymore.
So you really have to weigh these two arguments. On one hand, you have an administration that ignored a law, hid sensitive documents, and then immediately launched a war. I mean, it's a textbook distraction. But on the other hand, it's also true that wanting regime change in Venezuela wasn't some new idea that came out of thin air. It had been a stated goal for years.
So where does that all leave us today? Well, it's an unresolved, deeply polarizing question about the relationship between truth and power.
What is crystal clear is that this is no longer just some fringe theory. When you have nearly half the country believing it and major political figures debating it, it's become a powerful political hypothesis. It's the lens through which every single action from the administration is now being viewed.
And believe me, this story is far from over. There are some key events coming up that could give us answers. Congress could hold the Attorney General in contempt. President Maduro's trial might shed some light on the real reasons for the invasion. And a court could appoint a special master to finally force the release of all the Epstein documents.
Ultimately, it leaves all of us with a critical question for our times. When a government has the power to just change the channel from a scandal to a war, how can we, the public, ever be sure which story is the one that really matters?